Most of us have heard of the legendary Silk Road, the long caravans carrying precious silks from the Orient to the West. But what do we truly know about the salt roads? Could a crystalline rock that costs just a few cents today have triggered the fall of monarchies and served as the very foundation of the Roman Empire? To the historian and the behavioral ecologist, salt is not just a seasoning. It is the first strategic regulator of human development. You carry the same mineral in your blood that fueled the construction of the Great Wall. But for our ancestors, missing a single dose wasn't a culinary mistake. It was a death sentence. Our story begins in the biological tyranny of our own cells. For millions of years, our Paleolithic ancestors lived in a state of salt equilibrium. They were hunters, consuming sodium directly from the raw meat and blood of their prey. But then humanity made a choice that changed our biology forever. We became farmers. As we shifted to a grain-based diet, we created a lethal physiological gap. Grains are naturally low in sodium, and this imbalance meant that for the new farmers, salt was no longer a byproduct of the hunt. It was a desperate necessity for survival. But how did these early communities solve this lethal gap? The answer reveals the birth of intensive technical specialization. While in the Fertile Crescent salt could often be gathered directly from the crusts of dry lake beds, the pioneer farmers of Europe faced a far more difficult landscape. They observed wild game consistently gathering around natural brine springs and followed their lead, turning these spots into early prospecting sites. In the temperate forests of the Balkans and the Carpathians, salt was often locked away in liquid form. At sites like Poiana Slatinei in modern-day Romania, dating back to the early 6th millennium BC, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of what may be one of the oldest systematic extraction operations in the world. These Neolithic communities utilized a process known as briquetage. They boiled salt-saturated spring water in specialized ceramic vessels until only the crystals remained. As researcher Olivier Veller has argued through his extensive work for the French National Center for Scientific Research, this production represents a landmark in human organization. It wasn't just survival. It was a coordinated communal effort that required specialized labor, from the systematic gathering of fuel to the crafting of heat-resistant ceramics. But this European model was just one path. Across the globe, humanity was experimenting. In the early agricultural sites of East Asia, researchers have proposed that farmers may have utilized salt-rich marsh plants, incorporating their mineral-heavy ashes into their diet to secure necessary micronutrients. Meanwhile, in Mesoamerica, the practice of nixtamalization, processing maize with alkaline minerals, helped balance the nutritional deficiencies of a grain-heavy diet, even if the primary goal was the release of essential vitamins. It was a global laboratory of survival. This mastery over salt offered a power that seemed to defy nature itself. Osmotic pressure. Through this process, salt draws moisture out of organic tissues, effectively dehydrating them. While the history of large-scale preservation is often tied to the first empires, organic residue analysis of pottery from the 7th millennium BC provides strong evidence that Neolithic communities were already processing meat and fish, with researchers increasingly linking these residues to early salting practices. By reducing the water activity within the food, they inhibited the growth of deadly pathogens like Clostridium botulinum, stopping decay in its tracks. This was the true dawn of food security. Salt turned perishable calories into a strategic reserve. As historian Mark Kurlansky observes in his seminal work Salt, this ability to preserve protein was a fundamental break from the tyranny of the seasons. For the first time, a surplus created in summer meant survival in winter. Humanity had learned to plan for the future. And the tool it used was a humble white crystal. The value of this mineral became so intense that it dictated the very architecture of human settlements. Take, for example, the site of Solnitsata in modern-day Bulgaria, dating back to the 5th millennium BC. Here, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary: massive stone walls over 9 feet high and 6 feet thick. In an era where most settlements were open and defenseless, these walls were a silent scream of defense. Scrutiny of the site reveals that Solnitsata wasn't a city for people, but a high-security production facility. Those cyclopean walls stood between a starving neighbor and the community's only source of salt. It was the first sign that salt had become a concentrated form of wealth that demanded physical protection. As the great river civilizations emerged, salt management became a pillar of the state apparatus. In Mesopotamia, the administrators of the Third Dynasty of Ur meticulously tracked salt as a strategic industrial resource. It was essential for the textile industry and for feeding the massive labor forces of the temple. A cuneiform tablet from the city of Umma provides a rare, verbatim look at this logistics machine. 654 liters of salt, for the salting of the fish of the goddess Nin Mog, delivered by the overseer of the fishermen. This was a command economy, where the palace controlled the flow of every grain. But this dependency had a dark side. Scholar Daniel Potts highlights that the intensive irrigation of the Sumerians led to salinization, a crust of salt that eventually poisoned the soil, contributing to the long-term decline of the world's earliest urban civilization. In ancient Egypt, salt, known as natron, was woven into the fabric of life and death. While it was the essential agent in mummification, its role in the living economy was the true engine of the pharaohs. The Ebers Papyrus from 1550 BC lists it as a critical medicine. To treat a belly that is ill, take salt of Lower Egypt, mix with malachite and honey, and apply as a poultice. The pharaohs exercised a de facto monopoly over the natron deposits of the Wadi Natron. By controlling the salt, they controlled the salting of Nile fish, the primary protein source for the thousands of laborers who built the pyramids. No salt meant no food. No food meant no monuments. This evolution from practical necessity to total statecraft reaches its theoretical peak in ancient China. The Guanzi, a philosophical text from the 7th century BC, contains the first sophisticated articulation of why a state should control this mineral. The advisor Guanzhong realized that direct taxes on income were visible and invited rebellion. He proposed a system of indirect taxation through salt. If you order the people to pay a tax on their homes, they will shout. But if you seize the source of salt and control its price, the people will pay 10 times the value, and they will not even know it is a tax. While the thinkers of ancient China were codifying the first tax laws, the hunger for salt was triggering a parallel revolution thousands of miles away. In a world the East didn't even know existed. In the jungles of Mesoamerica, the rise of the Maya civilization was not fueled by gold. It was fueled by salt. To the Maya, salt was more than a nutrient. It was a high-value currency and a biological stabilizer in the humid tropics. Recent LiDAR technology and underwater archaeology at sites like Paynes Creek in modern-day Belize have revealed an astonishing truth. Hundreds of submerged salt kitchens, preserved for centuries beneath the seafloor. These were not small operations. As anthropologist Heather McKillop's research demonstrates, the Maya were industrial-scale producers. They boiled seawater in massive ceramic vessels to create standardized salt cakes, which were then transported by canoe deep into the rainforest. Why was this so critical? While cities like Calakmul were positioned closer to northern coastal resources, urban giants in the deep interior like Tikal faced a logistical nightmare. These cities housed tens of thousands of people. Without a constant supply of salt to preserve maize and protein, they would have faced systemic collapse. The Maya elites understood this completely. Control the coastal salt pans, and you control the lifeblood of every city in the interior. But while the Maya were industrializing the tropics, the Old World was entering the Iron Age. And salt production was about to go underground. In the heart of the Austrian Alps, the site of Hallstatt became an economic powerhouse. By 800 BC, the Celts here were not scraping salt from the surface. They were engineering deep shaft mines, reaching hundreds of feet into the earth. It was a brutal, high-tech environment for its time. Archaeologists have uncovered perfectly preserved leather backpacks and wooden torches, kept intact for millennia by the very salt the miners were extracting. The wealth this generated was extraordinary. In Celtic tombs at Hallstatt, we find Greek pottery and Etruscan bronze, objects that simply should not be in the middle of the Alps. Hallstatt was not just a mine. It was a central node in a globalizing economy, centuries before that word existed. Parallel to this, the master navigators of the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians, were perfecting a different method entirely: solar evaporation. They established massive salt works, known as saline, from the coast of North Africa all the way to Iberia. Salt was their enabling technology. It allowed them to preserve Atlantic fish, turning a perishable catch into a standardized commodity that could cross the entire Mediterranean. This was the birth of the first truly international supply chain. By the 5th century BC, these routes were so strategically vital that even Herodotus paused to document them. In his histories, he describes a salt road cutting through the Libyan desert, where he observed, "Along this ridge of salt, there are houses built of salt blocks, for in these parts of Libya, it never rains. If it did, the houses would melt away." Herodotus often favored the dramatic. But his observation confirms a fundamental truth. Salt dictated the very geography of human movement. As this global network expanded, however, salt became entangled with something darker. The ethics of human value. The phrase, "worth is salt," is one of the most debated linguistic artifacts in history. Popular lore often claims that captives were exchanged for their weight in salt. The historical reality, as found in the writings of Pliny the Elder, is more nuanced. In his Naturalis Historia, Pliny documents the profound role of salt in ancient commerce. And historians have noted that in certain regions, salt functioned as a primary medium of exchange, including in markets for unfree labor. It is a grim reminder. In the ancient world, human worth was often measured against the scarcity of a mineral. If the Phoenicians were the merchants of salt, the Romans were its master architects. To understand Rome, you must understand one thing. Its very birth was tied to a crystalline monopoly. Long before the first emperor, the early Romans fought their neighbors, the Sabines, for a single reason: control over the saline, the salt pans at the mouth of the Tiber River. This was not a local skirmish. It was the first Roman war for a strategic resource. The result was the construction of the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. We often imagine Roman roads as routes for marching legions. But the Via Salaria was first and foremost an industrial artery, designed to carry salt from the coast into the heart of the Italian interior. As the Republic expanded, the Roman Senate discovered something powerful. Salt was the ultimate tool of social control. In times of war or famine, they would lower the price of salt to win the favor of the common people, or raise it to fund military campaigns. It was the world's first sophisticated subsidy system. The historian Livy makes clear that the state's ability to provide affordable salt was seen as a fundamental part of its contract with the Roman people. But the true genius of the Roman salt system lay in the military. This brings us to the Salarium, the root of our modern word, salary. Here, historians disagree. Ancient sources like Pliny the Elder suggest a direct link between salt and military pay. Traditional interpretations held that soldiers were paid directly in salt. Modern scholars, including James Cargill, argue the salarium was more likely a specialized allowance used to purchase the mineral. The debate continues. But the strategic reality was absolute. A Roman soldier in the field needed vast quantities of salt, not just for his own body, but for the pack animals that carried his equipment, and for the preservation of his rations. A legionary without salt was a soldier whose strength would fail, whose wounds would not heal, and whose food would rot. Gold can be hoarded, but salt must be consumed. As the Roman architect Vitruvius noted in his De Architectura, the selection of sites for new colonies and military camps always prioritized fresh water and favorable air first, with reliable access to salt following as an essential requirement. Without these pillars, the Roman system could not function. By turning a biological necessity into a structured military allowance, Rome had created something unprecedented. A blueprint of state control, written not in law, but in white crystals. Yet even the Roman machine had its limits. As the empire grew too vast to manage from a single center, the salt trade began to decentralize. Powerful local salt lords emerged, replacing state monopoly with private corruption. It was a quiet signal of the empire's eventual overstretch. But the story of salt doesn't end with the fall of Rome. It is a story that repeats itself in every grain we consume today. We have traveled from the biological tyranny of our prehistoric cells to the industrial kitchens of the Maya and the deep, salt-choked shafts of the Celtic mines. We have seen how a simple mineral, a crystalline rock, dictated the geography of our roads, the price of our loyalty, and the very structure of our civilizations. We call it a seasoning. But history knows it as the white gold that turned humans into citizens and citizens into empires. Today, salt is cheap. It is abundant. But every time you reach for a salt shaker, remember, you are holding the ancient currency of power. You are holding the mineral that built the world. And perhaps the most dangerous thing about salt is not its scarcity, but how easily we forget its worth. Because a state can survive without gold. It can survive without silk. But no civilization can survive without its salt.